The stagecoach wheel struck a rock with a crack that sent a shudder through the whole frame, jolting Evelyn Mercer from a half-sleep. Her head knocked against the hard leather siding, and she pressed a hand to her temple, her breath catching in the dry, dust-choked air. For 3 weeks. This unforgiving rhythm had been her world, the constant rocking, the groan of the axles, the flat, endless expanse of baked earth stretching out to a horizon that shimmered with heat and false promises of water. Outside the window, the territory rolled by in waves of brown and ochre, dotted with sagebrush and the skeletal remains of yucca plants. The sun was a merciless hammer in the sky, beating down on the land until it cracked and bled dust. It was a world stripped bare, a place of survival, not sentiment. Evelyn felt a similar bareness inside herself. At 22, she had been stripped of her home, her family, and the life she had known, leaving only a desperate hope for a future she could not yet picture. Her fingers, raw from gripping the hard bench, tightened around the 2 objects she kept tucked in the pocket of her worn calico dress. The first was a silver locket, cool against her skin. Inside, a miniature portrait of her mother stared back, her expression serene, a silent reminder of a gentler world left far behind in Ohio. The second was the letter, its paper softened and creased from countless readings. The ink, penned in a bold, masculine hand, had become a scripture of sorts, the words memorized like a prayer. "Miss Mercer," it began, "I have received your correspondence through the Matrimonial Times. My name is Harold Pike. I own a prosperous mercantile in the town of Redemption, Arizona Territory. I am a man of means, seeking a respectable wife to make a home. I am 35 years of age, of good health and sound character. I require a woman who is plain, hard-working, and obedient. If you find these terms agreeable, the enclosed funds will cover your passage." Plain, hard-working, and obedient. Evelyn had read those words until they had lost their sting, repeating them to herself as a kind of litany. She was plain. Her reflection in the dusty coach window confirmed it. Brown hair pulled into a severe bun, a face too thin from worry, eyes that had seen more grief than gaiety. She was hard-working. Her hands, though small, were calloused from years of mending, cooking, and cleaning in the service of the aunt and uncle who had taken her in after her parents' passing. And she could be obedient. She could learn to bend her will to that of a husband, if it meant having a home of her own, a place to belong. It was a fair trade, she had told herself, a practical arrangement in a world that had little room for a woman alone. The locket held the past. The letter held the future. She was suspended between them in this rattling wooden box. A mail-order bride traveling toward a man she had never met, a town she had never seen, and a life she could only imagine. Fear, cold and sharp, coiled in her belly, but she pushed it down. This was her chance, her only chance. When the stagecoach finally rumbled to a stop, the sudden stillness was more jarring than the motion had been. The driver's gruff voice bellowed, "Redemption! End of the line!" Evelyn gathered her small, battered satchel and stepped down into the street, her worn boots sinking into a fine, reddish dust that coated everything like a layer of rust. Redemption was not so much a town as a collection of raw, unpainted wooden buildings huddled together against the vast emptiness of the desert. A saloon, a general store, a blacksmith's forge, and a few other structures lined a single-wide street. The air smelled of hot dust, horse manure, and stale whiskey. Men with sun-scorched faces and guns strapped to their hips stopped to watch her, their eyes lingering with a frank, unsettling curiosity. She clutched her satchel tighter and looked for the mercantile, for the man who was to be her husband. She did not have to look for long. A man stumbled out of the saloon, a bottle dangling from his thick fingers. He was large and fleshy, his face florid and sweating. His shirt stained down the front, a thick, greasy mustache covered his upper lip, and his small, piggish eyes narrowed as they fixed on her. "You the woman," he slurred, his voice a low growl. He took a staggering step toward her, his gaze traveling from her simple bonnet down to the hem of her dusty dress. A sneer twisted his mouth. The picture you sent was more generous. You're scrawnier than a plucked chicken." Evelyn's face burned with humiliation. This was Harold Pike. This drunken, cruel-eyed man was the author of that neat, declarative letter. This was her future. "Mr. Pike," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "I am Evelyn Mercer." "I know who you are," he grunted, taking another swig from the bottle. He wiped his mouth with the back of his hand and gestured dismissively toward a 2-story building across the street that served as the town's only inn. "Got you a room over there. We'll get the parson in the morning. Tonight. I aim to see what I paid for." His words, spoken loud enough for half the town to hear, struck her like a physical blow. The men lounging on the saloon porch snickered. A woman peering from the window of the general store quickly drew her curtain. In that moment, Evelyn felt more alone than she had in her entire life. Her carefully constructed hope crumbled into dust, leaving only the cold, hard reality of her situation. She had traded one form of servitude for another, and this new master wore his brutishness like a badge of honor. She followed him numbly to the inn, her feet feeling as heavy as lead. The room was small and stifling, with a narrow bed, a wash basin, and a single window overlooking a dirty alley. The air was thick with the smell of stale beer and unwashed bodies. Pike threw her satchel onto the floor. "Get yourself cleaned up," he ordered, his eyes roaming over her with a possessive gleam that made her skin crawl. "I'll be back after I finish my business." He left, slamming the door behind him. For a long moment, Evelyn stood frozen in the center of the room, her heart hammering against her ribs. The letter had been a lie. The promise of a respectable home was a sham. This was not a marriage, it was a purchase. And as she looked at the flimsy lock on the door, she knew with chilling certainty that Harold Pike would not be a husband. He would be a keeper. Panic, raw and overwhelming, seized her. She could not stay. She could not marry this man. She could not let him touch her. Her mind raced, searching for an escape. The window. It was her only way out. She did not bother with her satchel or her bonnet. Her only thought was to flee. She pushed the window open. It gave way with a protesting squeak and scrambled out, dropping silently into the soft dirt of the alley below. Her dress snagged on a nail, tearing with a soft rip, but she did not care. She was free. She ran, barefoot now, having left her boots behind in her haste. She fled into the deepening twilight. She did not know where she was going, only that she had to get away from redemption, away from Harold Pike. She could hear shouting behind her, the sound of men's voices, rough and angry. He had sent his hired hands after her. The thought spurred her on, lending wings to her feet. The desert at night was a different beast entirely. The oppressive heat of the day gave way to a sudden, biting chill. The landscape, which had seemed merely empty before, now felt menacing. Strange shapes loomed in the darkness, towering saguaros that looked like silent, multi-armed sentinels, jagged rock formations that resembled sleeping monsters. The ground was treacherous, littered with sharp stones and thorny brush that tore at the soles of her feet and the hem of her dress. She ran until her lungs burned and her legs ached, the sounds of pursuit fading behind her. Or perhaps she had only outrun the range of her own hearing. She did not dare to stop. She stumbled on, driven by pure terror. At one point, she tripped and fell, her hands and knees scraping against the gravelly earth. She pushed herself up, sobbing, and kept moving. Her flight became a blur of pain and fear. She scrambled down a steep, rocky gulch, sliding more than climbing, the sharp edges of the rocks tearing at her skin. At the bottom, she landed hard, her ankle twisting beneath her. A sharp, searing pain shot up her leg, and she cried out, collapsing onto the sandy ground. She tried to stand, but the pain was too great. She was trapped. She lay there, shivering in the cold night air, listening. There were no sounds of pursuit now, only the whisper of the wind through the sagebrush and the distant cry of a coyote. She was alone, utterly, terrifyingly alone. Thirst, a desperate, clawing need, began to consume her. Her throat was a desert in itself, her tongue thick and swollen. She crawled toward what looked like the darker line of a dry creek bed, hoping, praying for a puddle of water left over from some long-forgotten rain. There was nothing, only sand and rock. Exhaustion, heavier than any blanket, settled over her. Her body, pushed beyond its limits, began to shut down. The world tilted and blurred, the stars overhead spinning into streaks of cold, indifferent light. Her last conscious thought was of her mother's face in the locket, a gentle smile from a world that no longer existed. Then, the darkness took her. Caleb Thompson saw the vultures first. They circled high in the cloudless blue sky, lazy black specks against the blinding sun. It was a common sight in this country, a sign that something's life had run out. A coyote, maybe, or a stray calf. But it was on his way back from checking his northern fence line, and it was close enough to warrant a look. He nudged his horse, Atlas, into a slow trot, his eyes scanning the ground. He was a man carved from the land itself, rugged and weathered. His face was all sharp angles and scene-etched lines, his eyes the color of a stormy sky. A thick, dark beard covered his jaw, and his hair was long and unruly. He was not yet 30, but the war and the years that followed had aged him, leaving a permanent shadow of grief in his gaze. He rode with the easy, unconscious grace of a man who spent more time in the saddle than on his own 2 feet. He found her at the bottom of the gulch, half hidden by a scrubby mesquite tree. She was a heap of torn calico and tangled brown hair. So still he thought she was already gone. Her face was pale beneath a layer of dust and grime. Her lips cracked and blue. Her feet were a bloody mess. He dismounted, his worn leather chaps creaking in the silence, and knelt beside her. He pressed 2 fingers against her neck. A faint, thready pulse fluttered against his calloused skin. She was alive? Barely. He looked around, his gaze sharp and assessing. No horse, no tracks other than her own frantic, stumbling ones. She had run herself nearly to death. He did not know why, and he did not care. All that mattered was the fragile life flickering in this broken form. With a gentleness that would have surprised anyone who knew him, he uncorked his canteen and dripped a little water onto her parched lips. She moaned softly, but did not wake. He wet his handkerchief and wiped the dirt from her face, revealing a smattering of freckles across her nose and cheekbones that were already beginning to blister from the sun. She looked young, too young for this hard country. He made his decision without a second thought. He could not leave her here. The vultures would not wait forever. Lifting her into his arms, he was struck by how light she was, as if she were made of nothing but bone and air. He settled her in front of him on the saddle, her head lolling against his chest, and turned Atlas toward home. His homestead was a small, solitary cabin tucked away in a shallow canyon, miles from any neighbor and even farther from the town of Redemption, a place he avoided whenever possible. It was a quiet, lonely place, which was exactly how he liked it. He carried her inside and laid her on his own bed, the only one in the cabin. She was burning with fever. For the next 2 days, he tended to her. He bathed her face and arms with cool water, forced sips of broth between her lips when she stirred, and cleaned and bandaged her torn feet. He moved with a quiet efficiency, his large hands surprisingly deft. He did not search her pockets or ask for a name. He simply worked to coax the life back into her, a silent, solitary battle against the desert that had tried to claim her. During the long, quiet nights, he sat in a chair by the hearth, his rifle across his lap, watching her sleep, a sentinel guarding against the ghosts of her past and his own. Evelyn woke slowly. as if surfacing from a great depth. The first thing she registered was the softness beneath her, not the hard, unforgiving earth of the desert, but a mattress stuffed with straw and a worn, heavy quilt that smelled faintly of wood smoke. The second thing was the silence, a deep, profound quiet, broken only by the chirping of a bird outside. She opened her eyes. She was in a small, rustic room. The walls were made of rough-hewn logs, the spaces between them chinked with mud. Sunlight streamed through a single, small window, illuminating dust motes dancing in the air. The scent of pine was sharp and clean. A simple wooden chair stood in the corner, and a stone hearth, cold and empty, dominated one wall. It was a man's room, simple, practical, and utterly unfamiliar. Panic, cold and immediate, flared in her chest. Where was she? Who had brought her here? She pushed herself up, her head swimming. A wave of dizziness forced her back against the pillows. She felt weak, as if all her strength had been leached away. She looked down at herself. She was wearing a man's long linen shirt, far too large for her. Her own dress was gone. Her feet were swaddled in clean white bandages. Her gaze drifted to the open doorway. A man stood on the porch outside, his back to her, staring out at the sun-drenched canyon. He was tall and broad-shouldered, with dark, shaggy hair that fell to his collar. He wore denim trousers and a faded blue shirt, its sleeves rolled up to reveal strong, sinewy forearms. He was perfectly still, a part of the landscape, like one of the stoic, silent junipers that dotted the hillsides. He must have sensed her watching him, for he turned slowly. His face was all shadow and angles, dominated by a thick beard. But it was his eyes that held her. They were a startling gray, clear and deep, and they regarded her with an unnerving intensity. There was no warmth in them, but no menace either. They were simply watchful, guarded. "You're awake," he said. His voice was a low rumble, like distant thunder. Evelyn swallowed, her throat still raw. "Where am I?" "My homestead," he answered, not moving from the doorway. "Found you in a gulch 2 days back. You were near dead from thirst." Her memory came rushing back in a painful, chaotic flood. Pike's leering face, the stifling room at the inn, the desperate flight into the darkness, the fall. She flinched, pulling the quilt up to her chin. A useless shield. She was at this stranger's mercy, a lone woman in the home of a man she did not know, miles from anywhere. The fear she had felt in redemption returned, sharp and suffocating. The man seemed to read her thoughts. "You're safe here," he said, his tone flat, matter of fact. "No one's looking for you." He paused, then added, "There's broth on the stove. You need to eat." He turned and walked away from the doorway, disappearing from her view. Evelyn listened, her body tense, but all she heard was the soft clink of a spoon against a bowl. He was not coming closer. He was giving her space. Slowly, cautiously. She swung her legs over the side of the bed. Her bandaged feet throbbed, but she could stand, using the wall for support. She made her way to the doorway and peered out. The man, her rescuer, was sitting at a small, rough table on the porch, eating from a wooden bowl. He did not look up. He had placed another bowl and a spoon on the edge of the table, an unspoken invitation. For several days, this was their pattern. He would leave food for her, and she would eat it after he had gone to work. He never asked her name, where she had come from, or what she was running from. He treated her with a distant, almost formal courtesy that was more calming than any reassurances would have been. He respected her silence, her fear. In turn, she watched him. She saw the way he moved, with a quiet competence, whether he was chopping wood, mending a fence, or tending to his single horse and 2 milking goats. He was a man of routine and solitude. When she was strong enough to walk without stumbling, he finally broke their silent truce. He found her standing by the corral, watching the goats. "You can't stay here forever for nothing," he said, his voice devoid of emotion. "The cabin needs cleaning. The goats need milking. I need my shirts mended. You work, you can stay, until you're ready to move on." It was not an offer of charity, but a business proposition, a way for her to earn her keep, to pay the debt she owed him for her life. Evelyn nodded, a profound sense of relief washing over her. Work was something she understood. Chores gave her a purpose, a way to fill the long, empty hours and keep the dark memories at bay. "I can work," she said, her voice stronger now. "My name is Evelyn." He gave a slight, almost imperceptible nod. "Caleb." And so, she stayed. She fell into the rhythm of the homestead. She scrubbed the cabin's wooden floors, milked the goats in the cool mornings, kneaded bread, and mended his worn clothing, her stitches small and neat. She learned that Caleb Thompson was a man of few words. He rarely spoke unless necessary, and his conversations were clipped and practical. He ate his meals in silence, his gaze fixed on some distant point beyond the cabin walls. She also learned that he was a widower. She found the evidence in a small, dust-covered chest tucked under his bed while she was sweeping. Inside, there was a folded wedding certificate, the names Caleb Thompson and Sarah Miller written in elegant script, and a single, faded daguerreotype of a smiling young woman with bright eyes and blonde hair. He never spoke of her. He never mentioned a wife. It was a part of his past that he had locked away, just as she was trying to lock away her own. He rarely went into town. Once, when their supplies of flour and salt ran low, he rode out at dawn and returned after dusk, his face set in grim, hard lines, as if the brief contact with civilization had been a physical ordeal. He was a man who had deliberately cut himself off from the world. Evelyn found a strange sort of peace in the isolation, in the predictable routine of her days. She began to feel safe, a feeling she had not known for a very long time. Caleb was a constant, silent presence. He was distant, yes, but he was also decent. He never entered her room, his room, she reminded herself, without knocking. He never looked at her with the possessive hunger she had seen in Harold Pike's eyes. He treated her not as a woman, but as another solitary creature sharing his small corner of the world. But the nights were another matter. The darkness brought the nightmares. She would dream of Pike's foul breath on her face, of his rough hands grabbing at her, and she would wake up gasping, her body slick with a cold sweat. One night, the dream was particularly vivid. She fled the cabin, desperate for air, and stumbled into the barn, collapsing onto a pile of hay, her body racked with silent sobs. She wept for the life she had lost, for the innocence that had been stolen from her, for the shame that clung to her like a shroud. She wept until she had no tears left, a hollowed-out vessel of grief. She did not know that Caleb was awake. He had heard her muffled cry and had gotten up from his cot on the porch. He stood just outside the open barn door, hidden in the deep shadows cast by the full moon. He listened to her weeping, his face an unreadable mask of stone. Every instinct told him to go to her, to offer some kind of comfort, but he held himself back. He knew what it was to be haunted. He knew that some sorrows were too deep to be reached by words, too private to be shared. Comfort from him would be a trespass on her pain. So he stood there, a silent guardian in the darkness, and waited until her sobs quieted into exhausted sleep. He did not move, did not make a sound. He just stood and watched over the broken woman who had washed up on the shores of his solitude, and in the quiet stillness of the night, he felt the first stirrings of a feeling he had thought long dead and buried, a painful, unwelcome, and undeniable connection. The days settled into a rhythm, marked not by the clock, but by the sun's slow journey across the vast, empty sky. Evelyn learned the contours of her new life through the work of her hands. She learned the particular heft of the wood axe, the warm, musky scent of the goats in the morning, the satisfying weight of kneaded dough beneath her palms, The homestead, once a place of strangeness and fear, began to feel like a sanctuary. The simple, repetitive tasks anchored her, quieting the frantic beating of her heart. Yet, beneath the surface of this newfound peace, a constant, trembling fear remained. A rider on the horizon, a sudden shout of a hawk, the crack of a dry branch in the woods. Any unexpected sound could send a jolt of pure terror through her, bringing back the image of Harold Pike's cruel face and the sounds of his men chasing her into the night. She moved through her days with a quiet diligence, but her eyes were always scanning the ridgelines, her ears always listening for a threat that might be riding in on the wind. She was a guest here, a fugitive living on borrowed time, and she never forgot it. The silence between her and Caleb began to thaw, not in a sudden rush, but slowly, like the melting of a frozen creek in spring. Their conversations were rarely about themselves, but about the practicalities of the ranch. He taught her how to distinguish a loco weed from good pasture grass, how to predict the weather by the color of the sunset, how to set a snare for a rabbit. In turn, she spoke of Ohio, of the green hills and the crowded towns, a world so different from this stark, beautiful land that it might as well have been on another planet. One evening, as she was mending one of his shirts by the light of the fire, she found the courage to ask a question that had been weighing on her mind. "The woman in the picture," she began, her voice soft, her eyes fixed on her needlework. "In the chest, she was your wife." Caleb, who had been oiling a piece of tack, went still. His hand stopped moving. For a long moment, the only sound was the crackle of the fire. She thought he would not answer, that she had crossed a line and he would retreat back into his fortress of silence. "Her name was Sarah," he said finally, his voice low and rough. He did not look at her. He set the piece of leather aside and stared into the flames, his face a mask of old, settled grief. "We were married just before the war. I went to fight. I was gone 4 years. He paused, and the silence that followed was heavy with unspoken pain. "When I came back, she was gone, left with a soldier from the Union garrison. Went east. Never saw her again." The words were spare, delivered without a trace of self-pity. But Evelyn felt the chasm of betrayal and heartbreak that lay beneath them. It explained so much: his solitude, his avoidance of town, the profound and unshakable sadness in his eyes. His trust in love, in promises, had been shattered, and he had come out here to this lonely canyon to live with the pieces. She said nothing, only pulled her thread through the rough cotton of his shirt, her heart aching with a sorrow that was not her own. A week later, the sky turned a bruised, angry purple. The air grew heavy and still, charged with a strange energy. A storm was coming. They worked quickly to secure the homestead, latching the barn door and bringing the goats into their pen. As the first drops of rain began to fall, fat and heavy, they stood together on the porch, watching the approaching tempest. Lightning, stark and white, ripped across the sky, illuminating the distant hills in a ghostly flash. It was followed a few seconds later by a clap of thunder so loud it seemed to shake the very foundations of the cabin. Evelyn flinched violently, a small, involuntary cry escaping her lips. The sound was too much like a gunshot, too close to the memory of violence and fear. Before she knew what was happening, Caleb's hand was on her shoulder. His touch was firm, grounding. It was not a gesture of intimacy, but of pure, instinctual comfort, a simple human impulse to steady a trembling creature. Yet, through the thin fabric of her dress, the warmth of his hand seemed to seep into her very bones, a startling and unfamiliar sensation. She looked up at him, in the dim light of the storm. His eyes seemed to hold a flicker of something she had not seen before, not pity, but a kind of shared understanding. He did not pull his hand away, and for a long, charged moment, they stood there, the storm raging around them, his touch a silent anchor in the chaos. The need for supplies eventually became unavoidable. Caleb announced one morning that they were low on coffee, Flour and salt pork. He would have to go to Redemption. A cold dread washed over Evelyn. The thought of him going to that town, where Pike might still be, where people might ask questions, was terrifying. "Let me come with you," she said, surprising herself with her own boldness. "I can stay in the wagon, but I do not want to be here alone." Caleb studied her face for a long moment, his expression unreadable. "All right," he said simply, "but you stay put and keep your head down." The journey to Redemption was tense and silent. Evelyn sat on the floor of the buckboard wagon, a burlap sack pulled over her head and shoulders to obscure her face, peering out through a small gap. Seeing the dusty Main Street again made her stomach clench. It was a place of humiliation and terror. She watched Caleb tie the wagon in front of the general store and stride inside, his posture rigid, his hand resting near the Colt revolver on his hip. She waited, her heart pounding with every passing minute. Through the gap in the burlap, she saw figures on the street, a pair of cowboys, a family with small children, and then a woman dressed in a severe black dress, her hair pulled back so tightly it seemed to pull her face into a permanent scowl. The woman, Martha Gregg, the widow of the town's former blacksmith, stopped and stared at Caleb's wagon, her eyes narrowed with suspicion. When Caleb emerged from the store, carrying a heavy sack over his shoulder, the widow approached him. Evelyn could not hear their words, but she saw the woman gesture toward the wagon, her expression sharp and accusatory. Caleb's response was a single, curt shake of his head. He loaded the supplies, untied the horses, and climbed back into the driver's seat without a backward glance. As they pulled away, Evelyn saw the widow still standing there, her arms crossed, her eyes burning with a bitter, righteous fury. The town was talking. The rumors had begun. The ride back to the homestead was even more silent than the journey in. The encounter had left a sour taste in Evelyn's mouth. She felt like a disease, a scandal that she had brought to Caleb's doorstep. He had saved her, and in return, she was tarnishing his name, drawing the hostile judgment of the world upon him. That night, after their silent supper, she knew she had to tell him everything. It was not fair for him to protect her without knowing the full truth of what he was harboring. They sat at the small table, the lantern casting long, flickering shadows on the log walls. "Caleb," she began, her voice trembling slightly. "That woman in town, she was asking about me, was not she?" He nodded, his gaze fixed on his empty plate. "Folks talk. It means nothing." "It means something to me," she insisted. "You deserve to know what kind of trouble you have taken in." She took a deep, shuddering breath, and the story poured out of her in a hushed, desperate torrent. She told him about the matrimonial times, about the letter from Harold Pike, the promise of a respectable life. She described his drunken arrival, his cruel words, the terrifying moments in the inn room when he had made his intentions clear. "He never," she faltered, the words catching in her throat, the shame burning her cheeks. "He never touched me. I got away before he could. But that does not matter, does it? In the eyes of the world, I am his property. I ran from my husband. I am damaged goods." The final words were a bare whisper, a confession of the deepest fear that resided in her heart. She had broken a contract, defied the role that society had assigned her. She was a ruined woman, not by any physical act, but by the simple fact of her flight. She finally dared to look at Caleb. He had not moved. He was watching her, his gray eyes steady and intense. There was no judgment in his expression, no disgust. He simply listened, absorbing the weight of her shame, the depth of her fear. He looked at her for a long, silent moment, his gaze so penetrating that she felt he could see every scar, every secret she carried. Then, without a word, he stood up, took her empty bowl, and went outside to wash it in the basin on the porch. His silence was not a rejection. It was something else, something she could not yet name, but it felt like a form of acceptance, a quiet acknowledgement of her truth. In the days that followed, a subtle shift occurred within Evelyn. The confession, spoken aloud, had not destroyed her. Caleb's quiet acceptance had given her a small piece of her dignity back. She began to feel something new, something that pushed back against the ever-present fear. It was a feeling of safety, a profound sense of security that she had never known. This silent, brooding man, with his own deep wounds, was her protector. He cooked her stew. He kept the fire going. He had placed his own body and reputation between her and the world. And with that safety came something else, something more dangerous and confusing. Desire. She found herself watching him as he worked, admiring the powerful line of his shoulders as he swung the axe, the concentration in his eyes as he repaired a bridle. She noticed the way a stray lock of dark hair fell across his forehead, the kindness in his hands when he tended to a sick goat. He was a good man, a decent man, and he felt as solid and real as the granite hills that surrounded them. Yet he was utterly unreachable, a man locked inside his own past. The fragile peace between them was shattered and rebuilt one afternoon in the cabin kitchen. Caleb had been trying to repair a loose board on the corral fence when his hand had slipped, and a rusty nail had sliced a deep, ugly gash across his palm. He came into the cabin, his jaw tight with pain, blood dripping onto the wooden floor. "It is nothing," he grunted, trying to wrap it with a dirty rag. "Do not be a fool," Evelyn said, her voice sharp with concern. She took his arm and led him to the table. "Sit, let me see." She gently unwrapped the rag. The cut was deep and bleeding freely. She poured water from the kettle into a basin and began to clean the wound, her touch surprisingly steady. He sat perfectly still, his eyes on her face, watching her as she worked. She tore a strip from a clean linen shirt and found her sewing kit. "This will hurt," she warned, threading a needle. "I have had worse," he said, his voice a low murmur. As she began to stitch the wound, her fingers brushing against his skin, the small cabin seemed to shrink, the air growing thick and heavy. She was keenly aware of their proximity, of the warmth of his body so close to hers. She could feel his breath on her hair, see the tiny flecks of silver in his gray eyes. She finished the last stitch and tied off the thread, her heart hammering against her ribs. Her gaze met his. The air crackled with a tension so palpable she could almost taste it. He slowly raised his uninjured hand, and with a feather-light touch, he brushed a stray strand of hair from her cheek. His calloused fingers were surprisingly gentle against her skin. It was the most intimate gesture she had ever known. He leaned in, his eyes searching hers, and for a heart-stopping moment, she thought he was going to kiss her. She wanted him to. She leaned in, her lips parting slightly, her entire being focused on this single, terrifying, wonderful point in time. But then, something shifted in his eyes. The light went out, replaced by the old, familiar shadows. He pulled back abruptly, his hand dropping to his side as if he had been burned. He stood up, turning away from her. "It ain't right," he muttered, his voice thick with a self-loathing that stunned her. He would not look at her. "You are someone else's bride." The words were a bucket of ice water, extinguishing the fragile flame that had leaped between them. He walked out of the cabin, leaving her alone at the table, her hands still trembling, the ghost of his touch still burning on her cheek. The shame was not hers this time. It was his, and it was a wall she did not know how to climb. That night, she could not sleep. She lay on her cot, curled up in one of Caleb's large linen shirts, the one she had been wearing when she first awoke here. It smelled of him, of pine smoke and clean earth. He thought of her as the property of another man, a mail-order bride who had simply lost her way. But he was wrong. She had not been running from a marriage. She had been running from a cage, in the quiet darkness of the cabin, surrounded by the vast, silent wilderness. Evelyn Mercer made a quiet vow to herself. She did not belong to Harold Pike. She did not belong to Caleb Thompson. She belonged to no one. For the first time in her life, she whispered the words into the dark, a prayer to a God she was not sure she still believed in. I do not want to belong to anyone but myself. And in that simple, radical declaration, she felt the first true stirring of her own strength. The near kiss hung in the air between them, a ghost of a touch, a question with no answer. In the days that followed, Caleb and Evelyn moved around each other with a new, careful stiffness. The easy, quiet companionship they had begun to build was replaced by a taut awareness. He took his meals on the porch again, his back to the cabin door, and he found work at the farthest edges of his property, returning only after dusk, his face grim and streaked with sweat and dust. He was building a wall, log by silent log, and Evelyn felt the chill of it even in the midday heat. She threw herself into her chores with a frantic energy, scrubbing floors that were already clean, weeding a garden that had no weeds, mending clothes that had no tears. The work was a penance, a way to keep her hands and mind occupied, to stop herself from replaying that moment in the kitchen over and over again. The feel of his fingers on her cheek, the look in his eyes just before he had pulled away, the harsh sound of his voice as he condemned himself. "You are someone else's bride." The words had been a brand, marking her as a property he dared not touch. The shame she had felt from Pike was a bitter poison, but the rejection from Caleb, however well-intentioned, was a deep and hollow ache. One hot afternoon, she took a basket of laundry down to the creek that trickled through the lower end of the canyon. The water was cool and clear, a welcome relief from the oppressive stillness of the cabin. She tucked her dress into her waistband, waded into the ankle-deep water, and began to wash, the harsh lye soap biting at her skin. As she worked, scrubbing Caleb's rough denim trousers against a flat, smooth rock, a small bit of the tension in her shoulders began to ease. A bright blue dragonfly hovered over the surface of the water, its wings a blur of iridescent light. A bird sang a clear, liquid song from a cottonwood tree on the bank. For the first time since she had fled redemption, a genuine, unburdened feeling of lightness bubbled up inside her. She was alone. She was safe, and the water was cool on her skin. She splashed a handful of it on her face, the cold shock making her gasp. A small laugh escaped her lips, a sound so unfamiliar that it startled her. She did it again, a real, full-throated laugh that echoed in the quiet canyon. From the ridge above, hidden in a stand of juniper trees, Caleb watched her. He had been checking a fence line when he saw her down at the creek. He had stopped, telling himself it was to make sure she was safe. But that was a lie. He had stopped because he could not look away. He saw her wade into the water, saw the focused intensity of her movements as she worked, and then he heard her laugh. The sound struck him like a physical blow, a thing of pure and simple beauty in his world of silence and shadow. It was the sound of life, of resilience, of a spirit that refused to be broken. And as he watched her, a fierce, protective wave of feeling washed over him, so powerful it made his knees weak. It was followed immediately by a surge of guilt, hot and sharp, that rose like fire in his chest. What right did he have to be near such a woman? He was a haunted man, a failure who had already lost one wife to his own inadequacies. His touch, his desire, could only tarnish her, could only drag her down into the darkness that he called home. He turned away, his jaw clenched, and forced himself to walk back toward the far corner of the ranch, the sound of her laughter chasing him like a beautiful, accusing ghost. A few days later, the threat he had been dreading finally arrived. It was late in the afternoon, the sun casting long shadows across the canyon floor, when Evelyn, feeding scraps to the goats, heard the sound of approaching horses. It was more than one rider, and they were coming fast. A cold knot of fear tightened in her stomach. Caleb rarely had visitors. He had never had visitors. She ran to the front of the cabin. Caleb was already there, standing on the porch, his body perfectly still, his gaze fixed on the trail that led into the canyon. 4 riders were approaching, their figures dark against the setting sun. They were rough men, with a hard, careless posture of hired guns. As they drew closer, Evelyn's blood ran cold. She recognized the man in the lead. He was taller than the others, with a cruel, sneering mouth and a long, jagged scar that ran down his left cheek. He was one of the men who had been with Harold Pike at the saloon, one of the men who had chased her into the desert. "Caleb," she whispered, her voice choked with terror. He did not look at her, but his voice was a low, steady rumble. "Go inside, lock the door, and stay away from the window." She did as he said, her hands trembling so badly she could barely slide the heavy wooden bolt into place. She flattened herself against the log wall, her ear pressed to the rough wood, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. She heard the riders pull up in front of the cabin, the sound of their horses, the creak of leather, the jingle of spurs, were unnervingly loud in the quiet air. "That's far enough," Caleb said. His voice was different now. All the quiet gentleness was gone, replaced by a hard, dangerous edge. "We are looking for something," the man with the scar said, his voice oily and smug. "Belongs to our employer, Mr. Pike, a piece of property that went missing. You seen a woman? Brown hair, kinda scrawny. Looks like a scared rabbit." Evelyn squeezed her eyes shut, bile rising in her throat. A piece of property. "There is no woman here," Caleb said, his voice flat and cold as river stone. "Just me, and I do not take kindly to armed men riding onto my land uninvited." "Now, hold on," the man sneered. "We got word from town you were keeping astray. A little bird told us you came in for supplies, and you were not alone." There was a long, tense silence. Evelyn held her breath, her entire body rigid with fear. She could picture Caleb standing on that porch, alone, facing 4 armed men. For her. "Your little bird is mistaken," Caleb said, his voice dropping even lower, taking on a deadly quietness. "I live alone. I like it that way. Now, I'm going to tell you one time to turn your horses around and ride out of my canyon. There will not be a second warning." Evelyn heard the unmistakable, soft metallic click of a rifle hammer being cocked. The sound cut through the air. A final, non-negotiable statement. There was a moment of tense silence, followed by some muttering among the riders. Then, the man with the scar spat on the ground. "Have it your way, rancher," he growled. "But Mr. Pike is a determined man. He gets what he pays for." She heard the horses turn, their hooves crunching on the gravelly dirt as they rode away. She waited, her body still pressed against the wall, until the sound of their hoofbeats had faded completely into the distance. Only then did she dare to move, her legs weak and trembling. She fumbled with the bolt and stumbled out onto the porch. Caleb was still standing there, his rifle held loosely in one hand, his gaze still fixed on the empty trail. The sun had dipped below the ridge, plunging the canyon into a deep twilight purple. He looked impossibly weary. The weight of the world settled on his broad shoulders. He had lied for her. He had faced down 4 armed men for her. He had put his own life in jeopardy for a woman who was nothing but trouble, a woman he barely knew. "Why?" she whispered, the word a raw, aching sound in the stillness. "Why did you do that? You could have been killed." He finally turned to look at her, and in the fading light, his face was a landscape of pain and conflict. The wall he had so carefully constructed had crumbled, leaving him exposed and vulnerable. "Because I do not want you to go," he said, his voice rough with an emotion he could no longer hide. The simple, stark honesty of his words stole her breath. It was not a declaration of love, not a promise of a future, but it was everything. It was the truth, stripped bare, and it forged a bond between them stronger than steel. That night, the storm that had been threatening for days finally broke. It came not with a gentle rain, but with a furious, primal violence. Wind howled through the canyon, rattling the cabin's single window and tearing at the shingles on the roof. Lightning lit up the sky in stark, jagged flashes, followed by claps of thunder that vibrated through the floorboards. Evelyn lay on her cot, the quilt pulled up to her ears, but she could not sleep. The storm outside was a mirror of the turmoil inside her. Caleb's words echoed in her mind, a constant refrain. "I do not want you to go." The fear of the riders, the relief of their departure, and the raw, overwhelming gratitude she felt toward this silent, complicated man all swirled together, leaving her emotionally raw. She heard Caleb get up from his cot on the porch and come inside, his heavy footsteps creaking on the wooden floor. He moved to the hearth and added another log to the fire, the flames leaping up to cast his powerful silhouette against the far wall. Suddenly, a flash of lightning illuminated the canyon with the brightness of midday. It was followed almost instantly by a deafening crash of thunder that sounded as if the sky itself had been torn in two. The cabin shuddered. Through the window, Evelyn saw a terrifying sight. A bolt of lightning had struck one of the tall pine trees near the barn. The tree seemed to explode in a shower of sparks. At the same time, the wind ripped the barn door from its leather hinges and sent it crashing against the side of the structure. The lantern hanging just inside, which Caleb always kept lit at a low flicker, was knocked from its hook. It fell to the hay-strewn floor and shattered, the oil igniting with a whoosh. "The barn!" Caleb yelled, already moving toward the door. But Evelyn was ahead of him. The sight of the flames, the sudden, violent chaos, triggered something deep and primal within her. All her pent-up fear, all the trauma of the past weeks, coalesced into a single, unreasoning panic. The barn was her sanctuary, the place she had gone to weep, the place that represented the fragile safety she had found here. She could not let it burn. "No!" she screamed, and before Caleb could stop her, she ran out into the lashing rain and straight toward the burning barn. "Evelyn, wait!" he roared, sprinting after her. She was already at the entrance, a wall of smoke and flame greeting her. She froze, choking, the intense heat driving her back, her mind paralyzed by terror, just as she was about to be enveloped by the smoke. Caleb's arm snaked around her waist. He grabbed her, his grip like iron, and hauled her backward, away from the inferno, just as a heavy wooden beam, engulfed in flames, crashed down exactly where she had been standing. He dragged her a safe distance away and spun her around to face him, his hands gripping her shoulders, his face a mask of fury and terror. "What were you thinking?" he shouted over the roar of the wind and the fire. "You could have been killed! Are you insane?" The rain plastered her hair to her face and soaked her thin dress, but she barely felt it. She stared at the burning barn, at the flames leaping into the dark, stormy sky, devouring the one place she had felt truly safe. A great shuddering sob ripped through her. All the fear, the shame, the exhaustion, the terror of the riders, the horror of the fire, it all came pouring out. She collapsed against him, her fists beating weakly against his chest, her body racked with deep, gut-wrenching sobs. "I am so tired," she wept, her voice muffled against his wet shirt. "I am so tired of being afraid. I am tired of running. I am tired of being someone else's property, something to be hunted and caught and owned." Caleb's arms came around her, pulling her tight against his solid frame. His anger dissolved, replaced by a wave of aching tenderness. He held her, letting her cry, his hand stroking her soaked hair, his body shielding hers from the worst of the wind and rain. He rested his cheek against the top of her head, the firelight flickering on his face, illuminating the tracks of his own silent tears. "I know," he whispered, his voice thick with an agony that went far beyond the burning barn. "I know." He held her for a long time, until her sobs quieted into exhausted shudders. He looked over her head at the fire, which was already beginning to die down in the torrential rain, leaving a smoking, blackened skeleton. "I am sorry," he said, his voice barely audible over the storm. "For all of it." For what you have been through." He took a deep, ragged breath. "I am haunted, too, Evelyn, not by what I have done, but by what I could not do, what I could not save." His voice broke. "My wife, the soldier. I was not here. I failed her. I am not a whole man anymore. I am not a man worth loving." His confession, so raw and painful, hung in the air between them. He was not rejecting her. He was rejecting himself. He believed he was broken beyond repair, that his heart was a ruin as blackened and desolate as their burning barn. Evelyn pulled back slightly, just enough to look up at his face. Rain and tears mingled on her cheeks. She saw the deep, profound pain in his eyes, the self-loathing that had kept him a prisoner in this canyon for years. He thought he had failed to save his wife. He had just saved her. He saw himself as broken, but she saw a man who was strong and good and fiercely protective. In that moment, her own fear fell away, replaced by a fierce, overwhelming need to heal this man who had healed her. She slowly raised a trembling hand and laid it against his rough, bearded cheek. "Then let me save you, too," she whispered, and she rose up on her toes and kissed him. It was not a gentle kiss. It was raw and hesitant at first, a desperate, questioning touch of her lips against his. He was rigid for a moment, shocked, and then a low groan rumbled in his chest, and he was kissing her back. His arms tightened around her, pulling her so close she could feel the frantic beating of his heart against her own. The kiss deepened, becoming a desperate, hungry thing, a raw and honest expression of all the unspoken longing, all the shared pain, all the fear and relief that had been building between them for weeks. It tasted of rain and smoke and salt and sorrow. It was a drowning man's gasp for air, a lifeline in the storm. They clung to each other, lost in the kiss, the burning barn and the raging storm fading into the background. There was nothing else in the world but this, the raw, undeniable connection between two broken people finding solace in each other's arms. But then, as if by some unspoken agreement, they stopped. They pulled apart, breathless and trembling, their foreheads resting against each other. The emotion was too much, too overwhelming. To go further would be to cross a boundary that neither of them was ready to cross. It was too soon, too raw. The kiss had been a confession, not a consummation. Later, after the fire had died to smoldering embers and the storm had quieted to a steady, gentle rain, they sat wrapped in blankets before the hearth in the cabin. The silence was no longer awkward or tense. It was a shared space, filled with the weight of all that had happened. Evelyn looked at Caleb, at his strong, handsome profile illuminated by the firelight. He was still watching the flames, his expression distant, as if he were trying to make sense of the new world they had just created. She reached out and took his hand, his large, calloused fingers closing around hers. "Caleb," she whispered into the quiet of the room. He turned to look at her, his gray eyes full of questions. "Would it be wrong?" she asked, her voice soft but steady. "If I gave myself to you, not as a bride, but because I want to?" The dawn broke, pale and bruised, over a world washed clean by the storm. The air was cool and smelled of wet earth and pine, but the scent of ash from the smoldering ruins of the barn was a bitter undertone, a reminder of the chaos of the night before. Evelyn awoke on her cot to a profound silence. The blanket Caleb had wrapped around her was still warm, but his cot on the porch was empty. She sat up, her body aching, her heart a tangle of hope and apprehension. Everything had changed. Or perhaps nothing had. She found him at the woodpile. He was shirtless, his back a landscape of tense, corded muscle that glistened with sweat despite the morning chill. He was swinging an axe with a savage, relentless rhythm, as if he were trying to kill something, to split open the heart of the world itself. The sharp thwack of the steel biting into pine echoed through the canyon, a violent punctuation to the morning's quiet. He did not acknowledge her. He did not even seem to know she was there. He just kept swinging, his breath coming in harsh, ragged gasps, his entire being focused on the singular act of destruction. "Caleb?" she said softly, her voice timid. He did not stop. The axe rose and fell, rose and fell. Evelyn's fragile hope began to curdle into a cold, familiar shame, the raw emotion of the night. The desperate kiss in the rain, his pained confession, her own bold offer. It all seemed like a fever dream in the stark light of day. She saw now that it had been a moment of weakness, a shared hysteria brought on by fear and the storm. He was a man of honor, and he was punishing himself for a lapse in his rigid code. He had not wanted her kiss, her offer. He had only been caught up in the moment. It had been one-sided. She retreated back into the cabin, the sound of the axe following her like a judgment. The warmth of the previous night was gone, replaced by a cold, hollow ache in the center of her chest. She had offered him the most vulnerable part of herself, and he had answered with a wall of violent silence. He saw her as a temptation, a mistake, a burden he was honor-bound to protect but not to desire. He had saved her life, and she had repaid him by becoming a source of shame. A quiet, grim resolve settled over her. She could not stay. She could not force him to live with this discomfort, this guilt. She had been a piece of property to be claimed by one man. She would not become a source of dishonor for another. He had saved her from the desert, from Pike's men, from the fire. Now, the only decent thing she could do was save him from herself. She waited until the relentless chopping finally stopped. She peered through the window and saw him head toward the creek, presumably to wash. He was moving stiffly, his shoulders slumped with exhaustion. This was her chance. Her movements were swift and deliberate. There was no time for tears, no room for hesitation. She went to his room and pulled on her old calico dress, the one he had washed and mended for her. It felt like a stranger's clothes now. She folded the linen shirt he had given her and placed it neatly on the cot that had been her bed. She had nothing to her name, no possessions to pack. Her only belongings were the locket in her pocket and the clothes on her back. She found a small, burnt piece of charcoal from the hearth and a scrap of wrapping paper he had used for supplies. Her hands were steady as she wrote the note, her heart a cold, heavy stone in her chest. "You do not have to save me anymore." She left the note on the center of the table where he would be sure to see it. Then, she slipped out of the cabin and went to the corral. His horse, Atlas, a sturdy buckskin gelding, watched her with intelligent, curious eyes. Her hands, clumsy but determined, fumbled with the straps and buckles of the saddle. She had never saddled a horse before, but she had watched Caleb do it 100 times. She pulled the cinch as tight as she could, her arms trembling with the effort, leading the horse toward the trail that led out of the canyon. Each step felt like a betrayal. She was stealing his horse, his property, but it was the only way. She would leave the horse in redemption. Someone would surely see that it was returned to him. It was a poor repayment for his kindness, but it was the best she could do. She had just reached the gate at the mouth of the canyon when she heard his voice. A raw, desperate roar that was nothing like his usual quiet rumble. "Evelyn!" She froze, her hand on the wooden gate latch. She turned. He was running toward her, his feet stumbling on the rocky ground. His hair was wet, his face was pale, and his eyes were wide with a panic she had never seen before. He had the note crumpled in one hand. He reached her, breathless, and grabbed the horse's reins, his knuckles white. "What are you doing?" he gasped, his chest heaving. "Where are you going?" "I am leaving," she said, her voice flat, devoid of the emotion that was tearing her apart inside. "I cannot stay here. I will not be a burden to you any longer." "A burden?" he said, his voice cracking. He let go of the reins and took a step toward her. "You think you are a burden." He looked down at his hands. For the first time, she saw that they were raw and bleeding, the palms crisscrossed with blisters that had torn open. The sight sent a shock of pain through her. "I saw you this morning," she said, her voice trembling now. I know that you regret what happened. I am sorry. Caleb, I never should have—" "No," he interrupted, shaking his head fiercely. "No, you do not know. You do not understand." He finally looked at her, his eyes filled with a torment that made her own pain seem small. "I was not chopping wood because I regret it. I was chopping wood because I wanted you so much I thought I was going to split in two. I was trying to beat it out of myself." Her breath caught in her throat. "Every time I look at you," he continued, the words tumbling out of him in a raw, broken confession, "I see something good and clean in a world I thought was nothing but dirt, and I feel like a thief for wanting to touch you, for wanting to keep you. I pushed you away this morning because I am not good enough for you. Evelyn, I am a broken man. I have nothing to offer you but my own ghosts. I pushed you away because I want you too much, and I was terrified I would destroy you." Tears streamed down her face, but they were not tears of shame. They were tears of a profound, overwhelming relief. It was not rejection she had seen in him, but fear, a fear born of a deep, undeserving love. "You are not broken," she whispered, taking a step toward him until she was standing directly in front of him. She reached out and gently took his ruined hands in hers, her touch so soft it was a question. He flinched but did not pull away. "You are afraid of wanting," she said, her voice gaining a strength she did not know she possessed. "I was, too, but I am not anymore. Not if it is with you." She led him back to the cabin, his big, rough hand held gently in hers. The world outside seemed to fall away, the canyon shrinking until it contained only the two of them and the quiet, sunlit space within the log walls. The air was thick with unspoken words, with the weight of his confession and her resolve. Inside, she turned to face him. The light from the window illuminated the exhaustion and uncertainty on his face. He looked like a lost boy, not the strong, stoic man who had saved her. She knew in that moment that she held his heart in her hands, and it was a fragile, precious thing. She raised his bleeding hand, the one he had used to punish himself, and she pressed a soft, gentle kiss to the raw palm. He sucked in a sharp breath, a tremor running through his powerful frame. Then, with a slow, deliberate movement, she took that same hand and placed it flat against her chest, directly over her heart. She held it there, her own hand covering his, so he could feel the steady, rhythmic beat of her life beneath his palm. He stared down at his hand on her chest, his gray eyes wide and full of a vulnerable, wondering light. "This night," she whispered, her voice so soft he had to lean in to hear her, "was supposed to belong to a stranger, a man I did not know, as payment for a home. I want to give it to you, Caleb, not as payment, not as a bride, as a gift, because I want to." A single tear tracked a clean path through the grime on his cheek. He did not speak. He did not have to. His eyes said everything. He slowly raised his other hand and cupped her face, his thumb gently stroking her cheekbone. It was a gesture of reverence, of awe. Their night together was a quiet storm, a sacred ceremony held in the heart of the wilderness. It was not the frantic, desperate coupling of their kiss in the rain. It was slow, tender, and intense, a journey of discovery. Every touch was both a question and an answer, a healing and a confession. His hands, for all their calloused strength, were infinitely gentle, mapping the lines of her body as if he were reading a holy scripture. Her touch was a balm on his soul, her trust a gift that seemed to unmake all the years of loneliness and grief. It was a joining of two solitary souls who had thought themselves lost. In his arms, Evelyn felt not a surrender, but a profound sense of finally arriving home. There was no shame, no fear, only the stunning, breathtaking rightness of being with him. For Caleb, holding her was a form of prayer, a redemption he had never believed himself worthy of. It was the passion of a man starved for warmth and the reverence of a man who had found something sacred in the dust. It was two halves of a broken thing finding a way to be whole again, not by fixing each other, but by fitting their broken edges together. Afterward, they lay tangled in the sheets of his bed, the moonlight streaming through the window and painting silver stripes across their bodies. The silence returned, but it was a different silence now. It was full and warm, a comfortable blanket woven from shared trust and spent passion. Caleb lay on his back, staring up at the ceiling, his expression overwhelmed, as if he had just witnessed a miracle and could not yet comprehend it. He had not spoken a word. Evelyn snuggled closer to him, laying her head on his chest, feeling the slow, steady beat of his heart beneath her ear. It was the most peaceful sound she had ever heard. "Caleb," she said softly into the darkness. He turned his head to look at her, his eyes shining in the moonlight. "It does not mean I am your wife," she whispered, wanting to make sure he understood. She was not trading one form of ownership for another. This was different. "But it means I trust you." A slow, beautiful smile spread across his face, reaching his eyes and transforming his entire countenance. It was the first time she had ever seen him truly smile, and it was like watching the sun rise after a long, dark night. He wrapped his arms around her, pulling her tight against him, and buried his face in her hair. His body shuddered with a single, profound sigh of release, as if a weight he had been carrying for a lifetime had finally been set down. They did not speak again. There was nothing more that needed to be said. Wrapped in each other's arms, they drifted off to sleep, two solitary figures who had found their way out of the wilderness by finding each other. They were both irrevocably changed, no longer defined by what they had lost, but by what they had just begun to build. The peace they had found was as fragile and beautiful as a desert wildflower, and for a few precious days, they nurtured it in the quiet solitude of the canyon. The shame and fear that had defined their existence were replaced by a tentative, hopeful intimacy. They moved with a new ease around each other, their hands often finding one another, their conversations punctuated by smiles that reached their eyes. They worked side by side to clear the debris from the burned-out barn, the shared labor a silent promise of rebuilding not just a structure, but a life. For the first time, Evelyn felt the stirrings of a future she actually wanted, a future rooted in this hard, beautiful land with this quiet, good man. But the outside world, with its harsh judgments and long memory, was never far away. The peace was shattered by the arrival of Jedediah Stone, an old prospector who lived a hermit's life in the hills and occasionally traded with Caleb for supplies. He was a gnarled, wiry man with a kind face and eyes that had seen too much. He rode up to the cabin one afternoon, his mule laden with empty sacks. He accepted a dipper of water from Evelyn, his gaze lingering on her with a gentle curiosity before turning to Caleb. "Came to warn you, Caleb," he said, his voice a dry rasp. "Was in Redemption yesterday. The town's buzzing like a kicked beehive." Caleb's body went still, his hand resting on the porch rail. "About what, Jed?" "Harold Pike is back," the old man said, and the name dropped into the quiet air like a stone in a still pond. "He came in on the noon stage, meaner than a cornered rattlesnake. He is looking for what he calls his woman. Says she was stolen from him. He is offering a reward, $200. A lot of money for a lot of desperate men." Evelyn felt the blood drain from her face. She felt Caleb's eyes on her, and she could not bring herself to meet his gaze. The past had reached for her, its cold, greasy fingers ready to drag her back into the darkness. $200. She was no longer just a runaway bride, she was a bounty. After Jedediah had gone, leaving a heavy, oppressive silence in his wake, Evelyn turned to Caleb, her mind already racing. The old, familiar instinct to flee, to protect the one person who had shown her kindness by disappearing from their life, rose up, strong and sure. "I have to go," she said, her voice a tight, strained whisper. "I have to leave, now, before he comes, before someone else comes for the money. I will not bring this down on you. Caleb, I will not let you be hurt because of me." She turned to go into the cabin, to gather the nothing she owned, but Caleb's hand shot out and caught her wrist. His grip was firm, unyielding. "No," he said, his voice a low, dangerous growl. "You do not understand," she pleaded, trying to pull away. "He will kill you to get to me. He is a monster." "Let him try," Caleb said, his gray eyes flashing with a cold fire she had never seen before. He stepped in front of her, blocking her path, his other hand coming up to cup her face, forcing her to look at him. "Listen to me. Evelyn, we are done with that. You are not running anymore. I am not letting you go. This is your home, and I will burn it to the ground myself before I let him set foot in it." His words were a vow, an unbreakable promise. He was not just offering her shelter anymore. He was offering her a fortress. He was standing with her, and for the first time in her life. Evelyn realized she did not have to face the darkness alone. Her fear was still there, a cold, hard knot in her stomach. But for the first time, it was not bigger than she was. She nodded, unable to speak, and leaned into his touch, drawing strength from his unwavering resolve. They did not have to wait long. They came the next afternoon, 5 of them, riding out of the heat shimmer of the desert like specters of judgment. Harold Pike was in the lead, his large body spilling over the sides of a fine black horse that was too small for him. His face was a bloated, purple mask of rage. The man with the scar was at his side, along with 3 other hard-faced men whose eyes were as empty and merciless as the desert sky. "Inside," Caleb said, his voice calm and steady. He pushed Evelyn toward the cabin door. "Bar it. Get the rifle." They took shelter in the cabin, the heavy wooden walls a flimsy shield against the coming violence. Caleb stood by the window, his Winchester rifle resting in the crook of his arm, his movements economical and sure. He was no longer just a rancher. He was the soldier he had once been, a man who understood the grim calculus of a fight. Evelyn's hands trembled as she took down the second rifle from the wall, the one he kept as a spare. The metal was cold and heavy, an alien thing in her hands. "They will circle around to the corral," Caleb said, his eyes scanning the terrain. "Try to use the cover. Pike will stay back. He is a coward." He glanced at Evelyn, his expression softening for a fraction of a second. "Stay low. Just load it for me if I need it." The first shot came from outside, a loud crack that splintered the wood of the window frame just inches from Caleb's head. He did not flinch. He raised his own rifle, took a steady bead on a figure darting between the rocks near the corral, and fired. The man cried out, a sharp, surprised sound, and crumpled to the ground, clutching his leg. The world exploded into a terrifying symphony of noise, shouts, the thunder of rifles, the whinny of a spooked horse. Bullets slammed into the log walls of the cabin, sending splinters flying. Evelyn huddled on the floor, her heart pounding in her ears, the spare rifle clutched to her chest. She was paralyzed by a terror so profound it stole the air from her lungs. This was happening. This was real. Men were trying to kill them. Caleb fired again. A calm, measured shot that drove another of the men back behind a large boulder. He worked the lever of the Winchester, ejecting the spent shell and chambering a new one. His movements fluid and practiced. He was a rock in the midst of the chaos, a steady, unmovable force. Suddenly, a new sound joined the fray, a voice shouting from inside the smoldering ruins of the barn. One of the men had managed to circle around and was trying to get a clear shot at the back of the cabin. Caleb cursed under his breath. "I cannot see him from here." It was in that moment that something inside Evelyn shifted. The terror was still there, a living thing clawing at her throat. But something else rose to meet it, a cold, hard rage. Rage at Harold Pike. Rage at these men who had come to destroy the first real home she had ever known. Rage at a world that saw her as a piece of property to be fought over and claimed. She looked down at the spare rifle in her hands and knew she could not use it. But Caleb's revolver was still holstered on the peg by the door. She crawled across the floor, her movements clumsy but driven by a new, desperate purpose. She pulled the heavy gun from its holster. It felt impossibly large in her hand, a tool of death and finality, but it was also a tool of defiance. She took a deep, shuddering breath, moved to the small rear window, and peered out. She could see him, the man in the barn, his back to her as he tried to aim at the front of the cabin. He was a monster who had come to hurt Caleb, to take her away. She was terrified, but she was resolute. She raised the revolver with both hands, the barrel shaking, and pointed it in his direction. She did not aim to kill. She aimed to stop. She squeezed the trigger. The gun bucked in her hands, the sound deafening in the enclosed space. The bullet went wide, striking the charred beam above the man's head and sending a shower of blackened splinters down on him. It was enough. He yelped in surprise, dropping his rifle, and scrambled away, disappearing from her view. Just then, another sound pierced the chaos of the gunfight, the thunder of many approaching horses and a man's voice, bellowing with authority. "In the name of the law, cease fire! Drop your weapons!" Through the front window, they saw a posse of at least a dozen men, led by the town sheriff, a portly man with a large mustache named Sheriff Brody. They rode into the canyon, their guns drawn, creating a line between the cabin and Pike's remaining men. The townsfolk, drawn by the prospect of a bounty or simply the spectacle of violence, had come to watch. The shooting stopped abruptly. Pike's men, seeing the sheriff and the overwhelming numbers, slowly lowered their rifles. Harold Pike, his face a mask of fury and frustration, stayed on his horse, his hands held high. The standoff was over. The fight for Evelyn's life, however, was just beginning. Sheriff Brody dismounted and strode toward the cabin, his eyes taking in the scene, the wounded man groaning near the corral, the splintered logs of the cabin, the smoking ruins of the barn. Caleb opened the door and stepped out onto the porch, his Winchester held loosely at his side. Evelyn followed a moment later, the heavy revolver still clutched in her hand. "Thompson," the sheriff said, his voice grim. "What in blazes is going on here? Pike says you have stolen his wife." "He is lying," Caleb said, his voice cold and steady. "This man and his hired guns rode onto my land and opened fire. They came here to forcibly remove Miss Mercer against her will. That is attempted kidnapping. The man on the ground is evidence of their intent. I was defending my property and the life of the woman under my protection." He looked past the sheriff, his gaze locking with Harold Pike's. "I want him arrested for assault, for attempted kidnapping, and for the mail fraud he committed to get her out here in the first place." A murmur went through the assembled crowd of townsfolk. This was not the simple story they had been led to believe. Pike's face turned an even deeper shade of purple. "That is preposterous," he bellowed from his horse. "She is my betrothed. I paid her passage. She belongs to me. She is a runaway, a thief. This man is a scoundrel who is holding her here against her will." The sheriff looked from Pike's furious face to Caleb's stoic one, and then his eyes settled on Evelyn. She stood on the porch, her dress smudged with soot, her hair coming loose from its bun, the huge revolver still held in her trembling hands. She looked less like a captive and more like a cornered animal that had learned to fight back. "Miss Mercer," the sheriff said, his tone softening slightly. "What is the truth of it? Are you here by your own choice?" This was it, the moment of truth. Every eye in the canyon was on her. She could feel their judgment, their curiosity, their suspicion. Her throat was dry, her heart hammering against her ribs. The old shame, the ingrained instinct of a woman to be silent and obedient, told her to hide, to let the men settle it. But then she looked at Caleb, standing beside her, tall and unwavering, his faith in her absolute. And she thought of the life they were trying to build, a life based on truth and trust. She took a step forward, her chin held high, though her body was shaking. "My name is Evelyn Mercer," she said, her voice clearer and stronger than she had thought possible. "I came to Redemption to marry Mr. Pike. I did so based on a letter he wrote, promising me a respectable life as his wife." She looked directly at Pike, her gaze unflinching. "The man who wrote that letter was not the man I met. I met a drunkard who publicly humiliated me the moment I stepped off the stagecoach. A man who, within hours of my arrival, tried to force his attentions on me in my room at the inn." A gasp went through the crowd. The women, in particular, leaned forward, their expressions shifting from suspicion to a grim, knowing sympathy. "I escaped," Evelyn continued, her voice gaining strength with every word. "I ran into the desert with nothing but the clothes on my back to get away from him. I would have died out there if Caleb Thompson had not found me. He saved my life. He gave me shelter and food and asked for nothing in return. I am here because I choose to be. I am not Mr. Pike's property. I am a free woman, and that man is a liar and a brute." Her confession hung in the silence, as stark and undeniable as the mountains around them. The truth, spoken plainly and without shame, was more powerful than any bullet. The crowd was swayed, the quiet nods from the women, from the blacksmith's wife, from the woman who ran the boarding house, were a verdict in themselves. They had seen men like Harold Pike before. They believed her. Pike sputtered, his face contorting with rage. "She is a liar, a whore!" But it was too late. His credibility was gone. Sheriff Brody had heard enough. He turned to his deputies. "Arrest him," he said, gesturing at Pike. "And the rest of his men, the one on the ground. 2, get him to the dock and then lock him up." Harold Pike was dragged from his horse, kicking and swearing, his humiliation complete. As the deputies led him and his men away, the assembled townsfolk began to disperse, talking in low, excited tones. The drama was over. Sheriff Brody tipped his hat to Evelyn. "You are a brave woman, Miss Mercer." Then he turned to Caleb, his expression hardening slightly. "I am glad no one was killed. Thompson, you were within your rights to defend your land. But I will warn you," he said, his voice low. "This is a small town. Not everyone forgives this kind of scandal. You and the lady best watch your backs." With that final, ominous warning, he mounted his horse and rode away, leaving Caleb and Evelyn alone in the quiet aftermath. The canyon felt unnaturally silent after the chaos. The air still smelled of gunpowder. Evelyn finally lowered the heavy revolver, her arms aching. She felt the full weight of what she had just done, of the lives that had been irrevocably altered. She had stood up, spoken her truth, and sent a man to jail. It was terrifying. But underneath the terror, she felt something else, something she had never felt before. She felt light, the crushing burden of shame she had carried for so long. The feeling of being damaged goods had been lifted. By speaking the truth in the open air, she had cauterized the wound. Caleb came and stood beside her. He looked down at her, his eyes full of a fierce pride and a deep, gentle tenderness that made her heart ache. "It is over," he said softly. "You are safe now." He took a deep breath, as if steeling himself. "You do not owe me anything now. Evelyn, you are free, truly free. You can go anywhere you want, start a new life. Your name is cleared." He was offering her an out. He was making it clear that she was not bound to him by any debt of gratitude. He was giving her the one thing he knew she valued most, a choice. She looked up at him, at this good, honorable man who had risked everything for her. She saw the fear in his eyes, the fear that now that she was free, she would choose to leave him and his lonely canyon behind. She smiled, a slow, genuine smile. She reached up, put her arms around his neck, and pulled his head down to hers. She kissed him, A long, deep kiss that was not born of desperation or fear, but of pure, unadulterated love. When she finally pulled away, she looked him straight in the eye. "Then let me give you something freely." The aftermath of the gunfight left a strange, profound quiet in the canyon. The violence had been a kind of exorcism, purging the last of the shadows that had haunted their sanctuary. In its place, a new life began to take root, one nurtured not by necessity or debt, but by deliberate, conscious choice. Evelyn started over. She was no longer a refugee earning her keep, but a partner helping to build a home. The rhythm of the ranch became the rhythm of her own heart, each chore a verse in a song of belonging. Caleb became her quiet teacher. He taught her how to sit a horse, not as a passenger, but as a rider. He put her on Atlas, his own steady gelding, and walked beside her for hours until her fear gave way to a tentative confidence. And then to a soaring sense of freedom as she finally urged the horse into a canter across the open flatlands. She learned the language of the land, the subtle shifts in the wind, the meaning of a hawk's cry, the tracks of deer and coyote in the soft earth. He taught her how to shoot. He started her with the heavy revolver, showing her how to hold it, how to brace against its kick, how to breathe before squeezing the trigger. Then he moved her to the rifle. He stood behind her, his arms gently guiding hers, his voice a low murmur in her ear. "Do not fight it. Become a part of it." Under his patient tutelage, the terrifying instruments of violence became tools of self-reliance. She would never again be a helpless woman cowering in a corner. She was a woman of the West now, capable of defending her own. Their trips to redemption became a quiet declaration. She no longer hid in the wagon bed. She sat on the bench beside him, her back straight, her gaze steady. The town's opinion, as Sheriff Brody had warned, was sharply divided. She felt the weight of it in the stares that followed them down the main street. Some were hostile, laced with judgment. She heard the whispers, the snide remarks that followed in their wake. Martha Gregg, the blacksmith's widow, made a point of crossing the street to avoid them, her lips pursed in a thin line of pious disapproval. Once, Evelyn overheard her mutter to another woman, "The rancher's whore." The words meant to be a lash. A year ago, they would have broken her. Now, she simply lifted her chin a little higher and did not grant the woman the satisfaction of a glance. But for every hard stare, there were other, quieter signals. A nod of respect from the blacksmith, a small, encouraging smile from his wife. Other women who understood the precariousness of their own lives, would meet her eyes with a look of silent, shared understanding. They saw not a scandal, but a story of survival. And in her, they saw a quiet strength they admired. Evelyn learned to live within this divided world, holding her head high, secure in the knowledge that the only judgment that truly mattered was her own, and that of the man who rode beside her. One evening, after dusk had settled, a timid knock came at the cabin door. It was a woman from town, Abigail Miller, the wife of a poor dirt farmer. She was wringing her hands, her face a mask of desperation. "Forgive me for coming so late," she whispered, her eyes darting nervously toward the dark trail behind her. "I did not want to be seen." Caleb invited her in, and Evelyn poured her a cup of coffee. The woman's hands trembled as she took the cup. They say in town that you stood up to a man," Abigail said, looking at Evelyn with a kind of desperate awe. "A powerful man. And you won." She took a ragged breath. "My daughter, Clara, she is only 17. I arranged a marriage for her, with a merchant from the next county. I thought I was doing right by her, but we have met him now. He has a cruelty in his eyes. He talks about her like she is a new plow he has bought. She is a gentle soul. Miss Mercer, he will break her." Tears streamed down the woman's face. "She is supposed to leave on the stagecoach in 2 days. She is sick with fear. I do not know what to do. I cannot fight him. But then I heard about you, and I thought, maybe Evelyn's heart went out to the woman, to the unseen daughter facing the same dark fate she had so narrowly escaped. She looked at Caleb, who was leaning against the hearth, his face grim but his eyes full of a quiet resolve. He just nodded. Once, the decision was hers, but his support was absolute. Evelyn reached across the table and took Abigail's trembling hands in her own. "I am not a powerful woman, Abigail," she said softly, "but I am no longer a frightened one. Either, tell me what you need." A week later, a new hand was working at a neighboring ranch, a quiet, gentle girl named Clara, who had run off from a bad situation. Her story was that she had been orphaned, and no one asked any questions. The merchant, when he came looking, was met with a wall of blank stares and shrugs. He left town in a fury, empty-handed. Evelyn had not fought a battle with guns, but with whispers and a network of quiet, compassionate women who knew a cage when they saw one. She had not just saved herself, she had become a source of salvation for others. As the seasons began to turn, a letter arrived for Caleb from a lawyer in Prescott. The land adjacent to his, a large parcel with a year-round spring, was for sale. The owner had died, and the price was fair. It was a chance to expand, to build something more substantial, something that could last for generations. That evening, as they sat on the porch watching the stars begin to prick the deep indigo sky, Caleb brought it up. "It is good land," he said, his voice thoughtful. "With that spring, we could run 100 head of cattle. It would be a real ranch then, not just a homestead." He was quiet for a long moment. "It is a lot to take on, a lifetime of work." He turned to her, his face serious in the dim light. "I wanted to ask if you would want a life here, officially." The question hung in the air, gentle but momentous. He was not asking her to be a wife. He was asking her to be a partner. But the word, officially, sent a ghostly chill down her spine. An official life meant a marriage certificate, a parson, vows spoken before the law and God. It meant becoming a wife. And for Evelyn, the word wife was still tangled with the specter of Harold Pike, with the idea of ownership, of becoming someone's possession. She loved Caleb with a depth that still astonished her, but she was terrified of cages, no matter how lovingly built. She did not know how to answer. She looked away, toward the dark mountains. I have to think, Caleb." He did not press her. He simply nodded, his face betraying a flicker of disappointment before he masked it with his usual stoicism. "Of course," he said. The easy warmth between them was suddenly strained, and the old fear, the fear of losing her newfound self, whispered to her in the darkness. A few evenings later, she was returning from the creek at dusk, a bucket of cool, fresh water in each hand. As she approached the homestead, she saw the soft glow of a lantern coming from the barn. Caleb had been working on it for weeks, salvaging what timber he could, cutting new logs, and slowly, painstakingly, raising it from the ashes. She set the buckets down and walked toward the light, her heart beating a little faster. He was finished. The structure stood tall and strong against the twilight sky, the scent of fresh-cut pine mingling with the memory of smoke. It was not just a barn. It was a testament to their resilience, a symbol of their shared life. Rebuilt from ruins, she stepped inside. He had cleaned the entire space, laying down fresh, sweet-smelling hay. The lantern hung from a new, heavy central beam, and it was there, hanging from the beam, that she saw it. A sign, carved from a single, wide plank of pine. The letters had been carefully burned into the wood, dark and permanent. It did not say Thompson Ranch. It said Mercer Thompson Ranch. Her breath caught in her throat. Her name. He had put her name beside his. She was not an addition, not a possession. She was a foundation. She was a part of the name, a part of the land, a part of him. She heard a soft sound behind her and turned. Caleb was standing there, his hat in his hands, his face full of a raw, hopeful vulnerability. He took a slow step toward her, and then another, until he was standing in front of her. Then, this strong, silent man of the mountains, this soldier and rancher, slowly knelt on one knee in the soft hay. He reached into his pocket and pulled out not a fancy gold band from a catalog, but a small, simple ring carved from a piece of dark, polished wood. A single, delicate wildflower, a desert marigold, was etched into its surface with painstaking care. She knew, without having to be told, that he had carved it himself. He looked up at her, his gray eyes shining with an emotion so powerful it made her own eyes well with tears. "Not because you owe me," he said, his voice thick and trembling slightly. "Because I want you to choose me." Tears streamed freely down her cheeks, but they were tears of pure, unadulterated joy. This was not a cage. This was a key. He was not asking her to be his possession. He was asking her to be his partner, his equal, his choice. He was offering her a home, not just in his house, but in his name, in his heart. She knelt in the hay in front of him, her worn calico dress pooling around her. She took his face in her hands and kissed him, a kiss filled with all the love and gratitude and peace she had found in this wild, beautiful place. "Yes," she whispered against his lips. "I choose you." He slid the simple, perfect ring onto her finger. It fit as if it had been made for her. He stood, pulling her to her feet, and they walked out of the barn together. They stood in the gathering dusk, the first stars appearing in the sky, the wind rustling through the tall prairie grass with a soft, promising whisper. Caleb's strong, warm hand found hers, their fingers lacing together, a simple, unbreakable bond. She was not a mail-order bride. She was not a runaway. She was not someone else's property. She was home. Thank you for listening to our story. We would love to hear your thoughts, so please comment where you are listening from to connect with others. Subscribe to the From Wild West channel and share what this story meant to you.